Welcome back to another episode of Worldie Unboxed. Today we get a chance to sit down with Andrea Pascual. Among Andrea's many other endeavors, she also hosts a podcast called Sushi Fridays. We will drop a link to her show in the notes. Aaron and I connected with Andrea to record a couple Sushi Friday episodes over a year ago. Now Andrea provides a bit of an update and discusses some of the benefits and difficulties of starting and maintaining a podcast. As always, follow our journey at worldiebrand.com and check out our YouTube channel and Instagram page for more content and updates. All right, let's talk to Andrea.
Aaron.
Hey, what's up? How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. Been pretty busy, but I mean, that's kind of life, right?
Right? Oh my God. It's like, I feel like I haven't spoken to you in forever.
It's been a while. I think it's been since like October 2023. A lot has changed since then. But how have you been? What's been up on your end?
Oh, same old grind. I'm still doing the podcast. I'm still doing my projects, my freelance projects. And I still have my indie fashion brand that I'm working on. I don't know if I mentioned that to you last time.
I don't know. How do you kind of juggle all that? Because I'm juggling a lot of stuff now too, because I got a day job working on my own business, our podcast, trying to build a little bit of an audience on social media. So it's a lot to juggle, but I guess how do you do all that?
Honestly, I do things in stages and I put things off. Like the podcast, I put it off for, I think, okay, so I recorded a bunch of episodes, but I stopped editing them for a while because I couldn't keep up. So I'm not the best juggler, I'll be honest. I do what's most important for the deadline, and then I try my best.
How many episodes have you done for your podcast?
I'm on 22, I think. 22, 23.
And you do it in seasons, right? Because I think I saw you talking about season 2 and how you're going to switch things up a little bit.
Yeah. So, okay. So season 1 for me was when I launched, which was last fall. And actually September, now it's going to be like a year. Actually, oh yeah, wait. Sorry, take that back. Season 1 for me was 2023, and season 2 now is 2024. And I'm actually still trying to figure out how to divide the seasons and organize it. It's a work in progress, I'll be honest.
How did you, like when you first decided to do a podcast, how did you make that decision?
So I listened to a lot of podcasts during COVID, during the pandemic, um, because I was at home a lot of the time, and I was listening to creative podcasts and like business podcasts, and I just felt like the stories that I wanted to hear and the things that I wanted to listen to sounded very homogenous. I don't know if you ever like fell into the black hole of like branding podcasts or marketing podcasts. It all kind of sounded the same to me, and I just wanted to have different conversations essentially, right? Um, and as well, I found that it was always the same people being featured on the podcasts. I just wanted different voices, like people who you've never heard of were working on cool things. Um, and yeah, I just decided to dive into it without knowing how to do it, kind of figured it out and still doing it today. So,
Yeah, I think that's a similar kind of reason why we decided to do our podcast, because I have jumped into the world of marketing podcasts a little bit, but not really branding podcasts. But I listen to a lot of entrepreneurship podcasts, and it's the same people over and over and over again. And it's always people who are super successful, right? So it's like 5 to 10 years after they built some huge brand, then they go on this podcast and they talk about their journey, and it almost becomes more of like a narrative or just them kind of forgetting all the hard times or just positioning the story so that they look good. And I was like, well, I'm kind of more interested in hearing from people who are actually building a company right now. And I don't know if they're actually going to be successful or not, right? Like if someone is successful, anything that they say, you can't really argue with it because you're like, what? I mean, it works for them. Whereas like if someone is actually in it in the moment and they're saying these different things, and you can kind of be like, well, that kind of makes sense. That doesn't make sense. But I'm like kind of interested to just follow their journey to see what works and what doesn't, and then how they pivot along the way. And then also, like you're saying, just like different voices. I feel like there's in a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, it's just like a very similar archetype of person. And I'm interested in kind of highlighting voices and talk and just like, talking to and meeting people from a lot of different walks of life.
Yeah, exactly. I don't care to listen. Well, okay, they present some really cool case studies and learnings, but sometimes I want to listen to the small mom and pop's shop who blew up somehow, or like what did they learn, and just like the smaller creator or creative. I'm more, I tend to, what is the word? I surround myself with like the creative community. So I kind of focus on people more so in fashion, like music, design. Worldie to me was fashion, part of the fashion segment. So I kind of focus on those businesses, things that I'm more so personally interested in. Um, and yeah, it's like the untold stories for me and the little cool gems of information. And I also, another reason why I started my podcast was I wanted conversations amongst my creative entrepreneurial community. I didn't think we were having enough. And honestly, I've had so much great feedback about just like listening to your story. I've had people talk to me about that and just my other guests. And yeah, I like the insight and the questions and the conversations that my podcast raises. So that was another reason why I started.
Yeah.
And why?
Would you do
Mhm.
it over again if you could, or do you feel like it's just too much work and now you're just kind of like, it's like sunk costs?
I got it. Okay, you know what? I'm still doing it. And it is so much work. And that's what I didn't realize when I started. And I guess maybe I would do things differently. I wouldn't launch it as a weekly episode. I would likely launch it as like bi-weekly or once a month. I feel like I dove in too fast and too much, but um and as well, I don't know if I could have sponsorships to help support my resources, then that's like that would keep me going.
Have you looked into that at all? Sponsorships or just kind of like trying to monetize?
I looked into it. I haven't approached anyone yet. I've had some conversations about it with other people, and actually a few creators have told me like you need to monetize because they know how much work it is. But I feel like I don't know, I'm not going to say I'm too small to do that, but it's not on my radar just yet. But I do think that to grow as a podcast, there's no way it could just be all me doing this. And I need resources to expand if I want to continue Sushi Fridays for sure.
Yeah, it is tough. It is a lot of work. And we had like a very, very small sponsorship. It was more so just like highlighting one of the brands that came on our podcast, and they gave us like $150 or whatever. And then I
Mhm.
just wore like their hat during some of our podcast episodes.
Mhm.
But it is like I've done some research just on the internet in terms of like based on like how much can you expect to get in sponsorship revenue based on your listenership, and it is like so small. So it's almost like you just have to find someone where they really want to get in front of your audience and it's just like a perfect fit, and then kind of just negotiate in like a one-off manner like that. But it is, I mean, it's a lot of work and it's not easy to monetize, which is another thing that I didn't necessarily like when we came into it. I didn't think that we were gonna make a ton of money off of it,
Mhm.
but I thought it would be pretty easy to break even monetarily speaking, which we're close to doing that, but still like it
Mhm.
is a little bit of a drain of cash. And then in terms of like time commitment, it's like it's not a break even type of thing. So I think like for us it still makes sense to do it because we one of the other main benefits is just we are able to meet a lot of people in our industry that we
Mhm.
wouldn't have been able to meet otherwise. But I mean, I don't know how long we can continue to do it for because we did basically like I took a year off between grad school and starting my day job, and we recorded like 30 episodes of the podcast, and we're still kind of releasing those. And in terms of episodes that I've recorded since I've started my day job, it's probably under 5. So if we didn't have that backlog, then like we'd probably be releasing like once a month or something like that. So it definitely is difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And how many episodes have you published?
I don't know the exact number. I saw it the other day. I want to say it's like around 25, but we started in March and we do basically every week. We've missed maybe
Oh,
like
nice.
a couple weeks here or there, but
Hmm.
I think it's over 20 and below 30, but I don't know the exact number.
Wow, that's a good run, actually. That's pretty steady.
Yeah, it is pretty steady.
Hmm.
Like we really did record a ton of episodes. And the way that we do it is we have kind of like 2 different types of episodes. So the first type of episode is just me and Brandon, where we're talking between the 2 of us, maybe giving updates on the business, things like that. And then the other format is we bring in another entrepreneur or founder, interview them. That's part 1. And then part 2 is me and Brandon kind of reacting to the most interesting parts of the conversation and kind of what we learned from that founder. So it's almost like we record, we get 2 times the amount of content from one conversation when we do
Nice.
those sorts of episodes. So that's been a way to kind of um, like make that backlog last for a little while longer.
Hmm. Cool. Um, yeah, I want to actually record more solo episodes because I find the interviews are a little bit more difficult for me in terms of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I mean the editing because I like to add my own segues into the audio and like the storyline. Um, and I feel like it took so much time and it does take so much of my time just editing. And for me, the solo episodes are so much easier. It's just like plan out what I'm going to say, record it all, don't have to listen to an interview literally 4 or 5 times to pick out the ideas that I want to highlight. Um, I also use AI now to help me to help my process. I use something called Opus Clips. I don't know
Yeah,
if you're
I know.
familiar with
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I've used the free version before.
Yeah, so I use that to for my video clips for promo. So that helps out like picking out key things. But I think my biggest challenge right now is time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Makes sense. With the clips, because I was gonna ask you about that too, because I've tried the clips, the AI clips, but
Mhm.
I don't like the way they kind of like cut certain things off or like they start like a second too late. And for me, it was like kind of hard to be like, hey, just start this 1 second or 2 seconds earlier, and then this is perfect. It was kind of like I had to go off and do it all myself if I wanted to make those tiny little tweaks. And then at that point, I was like, I might as well just do it all myself. But creating clips, like that takes like the most time because I don't do the editing on the podcast. I
Mhm.
do like the guest outreach. I run the interviews, like write the interview questions, stuff like that, and then I create the clips for socials. But that can easily like creating like 5 clips from a conversation can take me 8 hours.
Oh my gosh,
So
yes.
yeah, I mean, like, do you feel like it's worth it? Because I feel like just in the social media kind of age that we're living in, it's all about,
Mhm.
you got to create that 60-second clip to get people hooked. Maybe you'll get like 1,000 views, or even if you're a bigger podcast, like 10,000 views or 1 million views on those clips, and then that increases your audience. But do you feel like for you, it's worth it to make those clips? And do you feel like you're getting new listeners from those clips, or do you feel like it's
Mm.
just kind of like we do it because that's all the rage, but it's not necessarily an ROI on it?
That's a great question, and I still can't measure that. Um, I know, okay, so I'll backtrack to what you said about the AI video clipper. Uh, okay, yes, I feel like they cut out parts of people's sentences that I wouldn't have cut out. And sometimes they stop the idea short. And I'm kind of like, after 20 clips are generated, there's probably 2 or 3 that I'm kind of happy with. And then, yes, it does take a while to edit the clips on my own that I share to socials. So that's that. And then when it comes to the audience, I share the clips on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And right now, I'm not even sure if it drives listenership. I'll be quite honest, because I'm finding that there's so much conversation right now about, oh, get yourself on video. I've had so much feedback, and I kind of still am in that mindset of like a video. Wait, is your podcast video as well? Or is it audio?
We do mainly audio, but we have the video too, and we kind of upload that on YouTube.
So people have told me to publish the video version and do in real life interviews, whatever, right? I'm like, okay, cool. But at the same time, I don't think that the podcast video watcher, you know how there's podcasts specifically on YouTube only?
We do that now. Yeah.
I don't think it's the same person who listens to Sushi Fridays on Spotify, Apple Music, and as well, like as someone who consumes podcasts, I listen most of the time, like 90% of the time I'm listening on Spotify. I feel like it's also a different relationship and a different relationship to the podcast. Like I feel like an audio podcast is more intimate and a video podcast is like you're making dinner and your YouTube's on TV. And I can't gauge right now if the video clips are working for me.
Yeah.
I can't gauge. I'm not sure.
It's tough because, I mean, on LinkedIn, for example, I mean, video clips just don't perform well there. Like on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, those are way more kind of like video focused social media platforms. And we really only do YouTube. And sometimes we'll get like about 500 views on a clip. Other times we'll get like 8 views on a clip, but you don't really know who those people are and if they're coming back or if they're like watching or listening to kind of like the full podcast. But one of the things that I've actually found to be pretty helpful is sending the clips to the actual guests and being like, hey, your episode is releasing this upcoming week. Here's 3 or 4 clips and here's, the artwork from your episode. And then if they share that to their network, then that's a way to you get more listeners on that specific episode. You might not get a lot of people who stick around and listen to other ones, but you might get a few. But I feel like that's kind of like an easy way. If you're already making the clips, if you're already making like specific artwork for the person, if you share it with that person and tell them to share it with their network, then that's just an easy way to boost your numbers a little bit.
Ooh, that's a great tip. I am going to do that this week with my new episode.
Yeah, because I just noticed I'm posting all these random people, just videos of them in my network. I'm guessing they're thinking like, who is this person? I've never seen them before. I don't know who they are. Whereas like, if that person posts a video of themselves, then their network is going to be like, oh, my friend was on this podcast. Like, let me listen to this clip and then let me check out the full version of the episode, things like that. So I think there's just like a much bigger incentive for their network to engage versus our network to engage with some random person they've never seen before.
Very true.
And then you were talking about just kind of like everything that you have to do and it's not necessarily sustainable. So have you outsourced anything? Are you thinking about outsourcing anything? Or like, what are the things that kind of take up a lot of time that you want to push off your plate?
It's the editing that takes the most time for me. I have not outsourced yet. I've done it all. I use Audacity. Are you familiar?
I've heard it, but I don't actually know what it does.
It's a free audio editing app on desktop. So that's what I use. And I feel like if I can take that portion off my plate, it would be amazing. The only thing with me is I want to hear the story. Like I want to hear the interview a couple times because I find that going back to AI, for example, Riverside, I record mine in Riverside. You get AI show notes and like key moments. I don't think they're that great. I don't think they pull the cool things that I remember from the conversation. It's just like a boring summary. And that's why I need to listen to my interviews multiple times. So I don't know how that would work if I was working alongside someone editing, then it would still be my time side by side with a person,
Yeah.
you
How
know?
long is the conversation usually versus the final episode? Like, how much do you cut down from the conversation?
It's the conversation is usually an hour-ish, and then the final episode is maybe 40 minutes. So I cut down like repetitive things. I cut down long pauses and just I try to keep like the key elements and the key things that I think that my audience would be interested in listening to.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how repetitive certain people are and like how long they pause for or how many filler words that
Mhm.
they use that you don't really even realize when you're just having a conversation with them. But then when you listen to it back, you're like, that was 5 minutes and they repeated the same thing like 3 or 4 times. So I can kind of just cut a lot of that out.
Mhm. That happened to me last year. I was on a podcast. It was 20 minutes long after the fact. I was like, oh, okay, I probably repeated myself so many times, but all good.
Do you feel like having a podcast has made you like a better communicator or orator or not really?
I think it has. Um, well, it helps me organize my thoughts better when I'm talking to people. Um, yeah, I feel like it forces me to ask better questions on the spot, which I'm not great at. Like sometimes I'll have to like prep everything, but then when the conversation goes a different way, it's like, okay, now I have to improvise, you know? So it forces you to get into like a different train of thinking on the spot. Yeah, it helped with my communication skills a lot, actually.
I
What do
think
you think?
I think it's the same for me. So
Mhm.
I used to hate the sound of my own voice. Like I could not stand the sound of my own voice or my mannerisms. So listening to myself back or watching a video of myself would be super, super painful. And when I first started with the podcast, it was still like that. And then eventually I listened and watched myself for like 100 hours or whatever. And then I was like, you know what?
Mhm.
This is who I am. This is
Mhm.
the way I sound. This is the way that I move my hands when I'm talking about a certain topic. And then I just accepted it. So that's been something that's actually been like pretty valuable because now I feel comfortable like recording a video of myself, watching it back, seeing if I like it or not, and making changes based on that. I think filler words I've gotten a little bit better at cutting out, but still, I think a lot of people it's hard to completely eliminate that kind of stuff from your
Mhm.
vocabulary. I think like you were saying, like improvising in conversations, because if I'm just talking to a friend or some random person, it's easy enough for me to just come up with questions on the spot or whatever. But a lot of times with my guests, like I have a very long list of questions, very specific
Mhm.
list of questions, and I want to get through them in a specific sequence. And then
Mhm.
sometimes I'll ask a certain question and then they'll answer that question and then another question that I had later on. So I'm like, now I don't know what the follow-up question should be. Should it be the question that's after the first question I asked or the question after this question that's further down in the list, or should it just be whatever I think is, the most interesting kind of direction to take the conversation in. So I think that's definitely something that I have gotten a little bit better at, but still sometimes when I listen to conversations back, I'm like, man, I should have dug into that topic a little bit more. And instead of just checking the box and making sure that they answer that question and then moving on to the next question, viewing it more like a conversation and being like, oh, that was an interesting thing that you said. Like, let's unpack that a little bit more, that kind of thing.
I agree. Um, Last year when I was doing my interviews, first off, I was super nervous because I didn't want to make the guest feel strange or weird or uncomfortable in any way. And I wanted to make use of their time and as well impress them. So whenever something like happened, I would just freak out inside. Legit. I would just freak out like, oh my God, they answered question 10, but we're still at number 3. But yeah, it's a learning experience for sure.
It is. What is like your ideal type of person to interview? Like, how do they, I guess, behave, or how do they answer questions versus what is a little bit of a harder person for you to interview?
I think the one-liners, the people who just answer and then it's like a one-sentence answer, for me, that's hard because it's difficult to dig deeper and have a conversation. And I don't want it to sound like a job interview or just something very like clinical and cold. Um, and the people who I love to interview like to share and they don't give such expected answers. And they like to pull from their experience and share stories. Those are the kind of conversations and the people I like to interview.
Yeah, I think similar for me. I think people who
Mhm.
tell stories, it just makes it easier. And people who, instead of always just answering your question super literally, it's
Mhm.
kind of like, well, this question I don't have a great answer, but I can start to answer that and then transition into answering another question that I have a better answer to. Um, and then kind of at the same time, like people who are super talkative, sometimes it can be hard for me to cut them off and be like, okay, that's enough on this
Mhm.
subject. Let's switch gears a little bit. So it's kind of like a push and pull. But I agree with
Mhm.
you. Like I don't think I've had anyone. I've definitely had conversations, in life with people like that. But I don't think I've had any conversations with people on our podcast where they just give one word answers or one sentence answers. I'd be curious, like, why are they even on a podcast at that point in time? But
Yeah.
the only other thing is like for our space, like in footwear, it can be a little bit esoteric where if you're not in the space, you're not really going to know what the person is talking about. So sometimes people they talk in a way where they're just assuming that the audience are all experts in footwear or whatever space. So sometimes you just have to ask them, like, can you explain what that term means or why is that important? Just kind of like explain that to someone. Just assume, that the audience, they're laymen. They're not people who have spent 30 years in the footwear space or whatever other space that this person is in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. It's like communicating on LinkedIn in writing. They say to communicate at what is it, fourth or fifth grade level?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then just in general, 'cause a lot of people, I don't know if you have the same thing, but a lot of people that I know, this is for a long time before I even started my own podcast, they're like, I should start a podcast. And then maybe they tell you their idea. And then now for me, I'm just kind of like, it's pretty easy to start a podcast. It's pretty cheap. Um, like if you don't do a ton of editing, like you could probably just order some mics in a week and then just start recording. But then a lot of people they don't really do anything, right? So who do you think should start a podcast and who do you think maybe it doesn't really make sense to start a podcast, even if you have that idea?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. Who should? Okay, people who are curious, for one, about other people and who like to have conversation, doesn't matter what kind. People who have a story to tell. Um, and when I say that, I mean, is it like a mystery series? Like, are you sharing your fictional topic? And is it something like that? So if you have a story, you're curious about other people, you want to do interviews, if you want to share about your journey, I think you should start your podcast, especially if you're building something and you're building something scrappily, scrappily. Like you are on that grind. I feel like you should start it. And from a business perspective, I feel like that helps you build your brand, you know? So what I think you and Brandon are doing with worldie, and kind of tapping into like having interviews and also tapping into your stories, I think that's so smart. And that's why I'm inspired to do more solo episodes because it's about the person I'm interviewing, but I don't want to sound all selfish, but it's also about me. And I feel like a podcast is a great marketing strategy, long-term marketing strategy. That's like a long form piece of content. So yeah, I went from personal traits to building a business, but that's where my head goes.
So you mentioned personal branding a little bit. How are you thinking about personal branding in terms of your podcast, posting on LinkedIn or any other social media platforms that you have? Because it can be a lot of work, but I think it's a good strategy, and I think there's a ton of benefit that comes from it. But you just kind of have to have some kind of strategy in terms of time allocation, because you could spend 24 hours a day just creating content for social media.
Mhm, mhm. Um, Definitely block your time out. And this advice is for myself. Because I do think personal branding is important from a founder perspective. I went to a conference last week and it was for e-commerce founders, and I was just so inspired by the way that they were sharing their stories on stage. And I feel like that's an extension of their brand story. And your podcast is an extension of your personal brand and your brand story. Um, and I feel like, are you familiar with Midday Squares? They're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
so Jake, who's one of the founders, I feel like he's so great at personal branding and sharing his founder story and then linking it to his brand. I feel like that is the ideal combination, building your business and building your personal brand at the same time. And you can do that through all sorts of social media.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I hear his name. I'm connected with him on LinkedIn. I don't know him personally, but I hear his name come up all the time. So he's got to be doing something right if
Mhm.
everyone is mentioning him. But I mean, I kind of feel the same way about personal branding and creating content. You just have to block time off to do it, because the thing for me is some days I'm just like, I don't want to do anything related to personal branding. I don't want to record a podcast. I don't want to record a video. I don't want to post on LinkedIn just because I'm so busy. So some days I'm kind of like, well, I have to set aside some time to do that. And then other days it's like, man, I just spent like 12 hours creating content. Like I got
Mhm.
to put time aside to like actually move the business forward or do these other things, that I have to do in my life. So it's definitely kind of like a delicate balance, because you don't want to spend all day, every day doing it. But at the same
Mhm.
time, you want to be consistent with it, because I think we've all kind of seen those examples of people who they go after it really hard for like a couple weeks, and then they take like 6 months off, and then they come back for another 2 weeks, and you're like, oh, they're doing something completely different now. Like they've got
Mhm.
some new business that they're working on or whatever. And then they become anonymous for another year, and then they come back with another business. And I think that's just you're not as interested in that kind of person, because you're like, well, I know they're going to post for the next 2 weeks and they're just going to be gone, and they're probably going to move on to the next thing. And I don't know why they're
Mhm.
moving from thing to thing. And then the other thing I would say is there's so many people, this is especially on LinkedIn, but it's, basically every social media platform, where they only really talk about the good things, and they
Mhm.
try to make themselves out to be something that, like, if you're in the space, sometimes you're like, this person is not what they're making themselves out to be. But for someone who's not in the space, maybe they actually do believe what this person is saying. So I mean, it's so cliche, but being authentic, but not, because there's also people who like, they're inauthentically authentic, if that makes any sense. Like they make an authentic post where it's like,
Mhm.
I see through what you're trying to do. You're trying to like get credit for being authentic. But the people who are actually authentic and who are actually themselves, I think you can tell.
Mhm.
And like from our perspective, as people who are trying to create content, I think just being yourself, that's the easiest thing to do. So why would you try to be something else if it's harder if it's going to take more time, and if people are not necessarily going to want to engage with that? So that would be other, I guess, personal branding advice that I would give.
Mhm. I agree.
One of the other things you mentioned a little bit about individual episodes, which I've not done any individual episodes. There have been times where I've gotten in front of the camera and talked for like 5 to 10 minutes, and then maybe like cut it down a little bit, and then uploaded it to YouTube or LinkedIn or whatever. And it feels pretty awkward. I can't lie. Like I'll practice it like 5 times before I sit
Mhm.
down and record. And then as soon as the record button is on, it's like, okay, like I forgot how to talk or whatever. So how do you, I don't know if it's just like a me thing or what, but like, do you ever feel like awkward when you don't have anyone on the other side that you're talking to?
I actually don't. It's like I feel like I'm narrating a story. Um, so no, I don't feel awkward. It actually feels fulfilling, like I got something off my chest. Um, a few months back, I did an episode about my experience at a pop-up event, like a fashion pop-up event, and it wasn't what I expected. It was not it for me.
Yeah, I listened
And
to that episode. I remember you.
oh, did you?
I think I was on a plane when I was listening to that. I don't know where I was going, but I just remember being on a plane listening to that.
Oh my gosh, that episode felt like a great vent for me. And as well, a handful of people reached out to me after that. They were like, oh my goodness, I didn't know, and tried to offer ways to help and give their suggestions, things like that. So I didn't feel awkward at all, but because it's audio first. So once I start getting into video with that, I probably would feel awkward because I don't know how I would do that. I recorded that straight into Audacity, the audio editing app. So I feel like audio only solo episodes work for me. If it was video, I would need to work it out. I'm not sure how I would handle that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then another thing, because I think I've heard this with our podcast, like certain people are like, oh, I listened to this episode or I listened to this episode. And then there's other people who listen to everything, but those people are pretty rare. So do you feel like it's the same for you where people kind of pick and choose episodes that they feel like are interesting that they listen to? And then there's a smaller group that listen to everything? Or like, do you have any sense of that breakdown, or have you heard anyone just personally kind of saying like, oh, I really like this episode, or other people saying, you know, I've listened to every single episode that you've put out?
Definitely have not heard people say I listen to every episode. I wish there was a way to track that. If there is, like, I want to know it. But they do pick out the episodes that are their favorites. And yeah, it's mostly about specific episodes and what they thought was interesting. I'm actually surprised that, like, a year later, people are just starting to listen to Sushi Fridays. So they're talking about episodes from last year. I'm like, cool, my plan worked. Because I don't want Sushi Fridays to just be publish it and forget about it. You know, I want it to live on wherever it lives, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And I want it to be a long-term thing. So I'm happy that they're finding old episodes, and I want them to listen to every single one. But I know that people have different interests, and they have different sorts of guests that they prefer listening to. And yeah, that's something that I'm still learning about.
I think one of the things that I didn't quite realize until I got into being a podcaster myself is
Mhm.
an episode is, it's going to be highly, this might sound obvious to you, but how interesting an episode is going to be highly dependent on the guest. If you're doing an interview, where like, even if you love the host, if they bring on a guest who's just kind of boring, or they're talking about something you don't really care about, you're not necessarily going to really enjoy that episode. Whereas even if you don't like the host, if the guest is like really engaging, their story is really interesting. Because I've even had I've listened to certain podcasts where while while the host is asking the question, I'll like put it on mute or like the lowest possible volume setting, just because I find the host so annoying. And then I turn it back up once the guest starts talking, just because like the guest is that interesting. And then there's other times where I'm like, the host, like I love the host. They ask really good questions. They're really engaging, but this guest, they're so boring. Like I just can't do it. So I think that's one of the things I didn't necessarily realize either. It's like, you kind of, you can only do so much to make a guest engaging, and they might have like a really interesting background or backstory, but kind of like what you were saying before, if you're asking them questions and they're just giving you one word answers or one sentence answers, there's not really a ton you can do. And probably with that episode, a lot of people might drop off after they hear that style of answering questions because it's just not engaging.
Hmm. I agree. I agree. They have to, yeah, there needs the engagement and chemistry especially has to be there, and it needs to stay up. It can't be like dipping. I feel like that's when the guests will just close and go to another podcast.
Yeah, it is tough because do you interview people only who you know or who you've talked to before, or do you ever talk to people for the first time on your podcast?
A lot of first timers actually.
It's the same for me.
Hmm.
I know there's certain podcasts where they'll set up like 30 minutes or an hour either right before or the day before just to get to know the person. For me, I don't really have time to do that. And
Hmm.
also I kind of like meeting the person for the first time on a podcast because then the questions I'm asking are genuine. It's not like, oh, you brought this up yesterday. Like, let me act like
Hmm.
I don't know this fact about you and ask you about it and try to get you to talk about it. So I kind of like having that, discovery process or getting to know the guest with the listener. So I like kind of meeting people for the first time on the podcast, but there's a risk because there might not be that chemistry there, or they might say some wacky stuff or whatever, which makes it a little bit. You might have to edit it a little bit more. Or you even have to like maybe beep them out if they're like using a ton of profanity, things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I do. I don't know. Did I meet you? Did I have a chat with you before our recording? I don't remember
I
anymore.
don't think so. I think we had gone back and forth like over email and then LinkedIn a little bit, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we'd ever talked on the phone or anything like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's exciting to meet the guests for the first time. And like the questions feel like I'm genuinely curious about whatever I want to ask them. So I do like meeting them for the first time. But sometimes I give people the option if they want to chat with me a couple days before, then we can do that. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I've had guests basically ask the same, like, hey, can we chat before the podcast just so like we know each other a little bit? I'm like, yeah, that's fine. It's
Hmm.
easy enough for me to do that. I don't necessarily want to do that for everyone if I don't have to, but
Hmm.
it feels like a fair request on their end. So do you ever kind of set up a podcast or try to set up a podcast with someone just because you want to get to know them or meet them? Because that's been actually one of the biggest benefits of our podcast is that it's just a really great networking tool. So like I tell a lot of my friends, like, before we had a podcast, if I reach out to someone and I say like, hey, I want to talk to you for an hour or 90 minutes, are you interested? That 95% of people would say no. But if you
Hmm.
say like, hey, I want to have you on my podcast, are you interested? Then it becomes like 95% of people say yes. So it's just a good way to meet people who might not want to talk to you otherwise. So have you noticed that as well? Have you kind of used that to your benefit at all or not really?
Well, that's such a good question. Okay, so every guest that I invite, I always want to meet them. Um, but I mean, in particular, there was one guest, his name was Rafe Edelberg. He's a Canadian designer. And a previous guest told me that he was mentored by him um, a while back. And so I looked him up because I like to do the research after the fact. I'm like, ooh, who did this guest talk about? I want to learn about these people. And when I found out about him, I was like, I need to meet him. I really want to just talk to him and I want to hear what he has to say. So I feel like he was one that I specifically reached out to for that. Um, and all the other guests, I thought that they were just interesting and I felt that they were a fit for Sushi Fridays. Um, Mind you, even getting guests on as getting guests on the podcast was so tough for me last year. I don't know if I ever mentioned that to you, but I guess it's because my podcast was so new that the rate of people saying yes was horrible. So it was that like I just had to push for like I tried so hard to get the ideal guests on and it was a challenge. It wasn't like I'm gonna reach out, they're gonna say yes, okay, cool. It was like keep pushing for these guests because I want to do this. So I feel like I had to overcome that barrier first.
That makes sense. And I think for us, it's a little bit easier because the people that we're bringing on, naturally, they want to promote themselves. They want platforms to promote themselves and their brands. And a lot of founders are pretty comfortable talking about themselves and promoting themselves. Whereas creatives, because I've noticed this a lot with social media, like a lot of creatives, they don't want to seem to promote themselves or their work. Like they might post their portfolio, but I feel like there's a big opportunity for a lot of them to share more about their process or what their day-to-day looks like, especially for people who are not necessarily creatives. So I think that's just kind of like a bit of a cultural difference where like a lot of founders are just like going everywhere promoting themselves and making it all about them and their company, whereas I think creatives are a bit more like, I don't want to be out there in that same way. So I can kind of understand why it'd be a lot harder for you to get those guests on versus us.
I haven't thought about it that way, but you're right. Now that I think about it.
Anything else just kind of like podcast related that is on your mind or you want to ask me about or discuss?
So what's on my mind right now is sponsors. I feel like that's what is going to keep me going. And I know that you looked into it and they don't they don't pay a lot to collab with episodes, but I think the way that I'm looking at sponsorship is more resources. So how can I use how can you sponsor my use of your studio? Or how can you sponsor my use of your equipment as I grow Sushi Fridays? Because I don't see this as only a me thing doing it at home and just chopping everything up on my own. I actually do. If I want to grow this podcast, I feel like I do need to do the in real life episodes. So I'm trying to explore how I can get sponsorship for those resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like that'd be doable because I would think that there's got to be some podcast studios out there that just have unused capacity and maybe they're willing to give you that space for free for an hour or like 50% off for an hour if you shout them out, you know, on the podcast itself. And then like any clips that you post, maybe you shout them out, things like that. So I think there's creative ways to do that. Like, I think that's definitely feasible. And for me, I was thinking the other day about this, like, is there a way, like, there's got to be companies out there or organizations or whatever, where they're like, yeah, it would be really great to have a podcast, but we just don't have the time to do it. So like almost figuring out like that right fit where our podcast almost becomes like an extension of their brand or their company or their organization. And then they just cover all our costs. And I mean, it would be great if they gave us money too. And I mean, I don't know if our podcast specifically would make sense for that, but there's definitely podcasts out there where it's like the episodes that they create, the content that they cover, the guests that they bring on, like it's a really strong fit with a certain brand or company. And that company would almost be better off like branding the whole podcast versus just having like 30-second clip or 30-second ad, like, a minute into the episode or whatever.
Do you have a specific, do you have an ideal sponsor? Like who would fit your podcast?
I think it would be any kind of company or resources that help early stage founders get off the ground. So I know there's like certain bigger podcasts that are sponsored by law firms, for example, like, startup law firms, things like that. So, I mean, that would be a decently good fit, but I think it would be hard to like approach a huge law firm and be like, hey, we have this really small podcast. Are you interested in sponsoring us? But I don't know, because I think a lot of those platforms or those companies, I don't know if they necessarily make a ton of sense for very early stage entrepreneurs to pay for, just because you're not necessarily going to get an ROI based on how much it costs. So if there's some kind of like affordable software or service for early stage entrepreneurs that I really believed in, and I felt like, just about any early stage entrepreneur could get an ROI or benefit from it, then that would kind of be the perfect sponsor for me. But I can't think of what that company would be.
Mm-hmm. I hear you.
What about you?
Maybe some sort of product that was for small businesses, like an accounting software, something like that, like some sort of tech product that small business owners can use, or like some sort of financial software for small biz owners who are in the creative space. Or, oh my gosh, there's like so many. I could think of like coffee or wine. I don't know how aligned they would feel, but I mean like something, because my audience, I'm starting to see, or I'm trying to curate an audience who likes more curated things like coffee tastings or wine tastings, more lifestyle things. So maybe something in that space, or an airline, because there's a specific Canadian airline that sponsors creatives like DJs, artists, content creators. They would be ideal.
Yeah, the other thing that I've thought about is, I mean, this might sound stupid, but you could get the guest to sponsor the episode. Like the person, I mean, they probably wouldn't sponsor their own episode, but maybe like previous guests, they sponsor other episodes, and you're like, hey, this episode is brought to you by XYZ brand. Go to their website, get 5% off, 10% off, whatever. But I think it would be cool to be able to continue to highlight certain brands that we like, we like their mission and we like the founders, and getting an opportunity for them, not just to promote themselves on their own episode, but basically throughout the whole podcast. And like, if they can only sponsor like 2 episodes or 3 episodes, that's fine. And then you start adding that up and you get basically all the episodes sponsored. But I mean, maybe that's a stupid idea. Maybe people wouldn't want to come on a podcast and then sponsor it right after the fact. So maybe that's maybe that's not the best idea.
No, actually, I think that's a cool idea. I think that could work. If the episode aligns with that sponsor, why not?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think it's one of those things where we'll continue to look into it, because the other thing is we don't necessarily want to annoy our audience. I ran a poll about this on LinkedIn. I was like, how annoying are ads on podcasts? Like super annoying, somewhat annoying, not very annoying, not annoying at all. And almost everyone said either super annoying or somewhat annoying. And it kind of depends like how long that ad is and like where it's kind of positioned in the episode. And I think a lot of people end up just kind of like skipping over the ad anyway. So there's 2 kind of sides of that coin. It's like you add the ad to the episode and people get annoyed. And then also your sponsor is going to be like, well, I'm not getting value because people are just skipping over this. So that's just another thing to kind of consider.
Yeah, absolutely.